is Rollin James Hawley, MD. Dr. Jim Hawley is a neurologist who practices in Southwest Virginia and is a longtime member of the Hawley Society, advising on medical and genetic issues. He and Trudy are coordinators of the DNA Project. And Jim gave me the shortest introduction. So I'm just going to add a lot since he's my first cousin and tell you he's a wonderful human being. And he is so smart that he skipped his senior year of high school and went straight into Fordham. And then he studied in medical school in Philadelphia, right, Jim?
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, he's got 3 wonderful sons and a whole passel of grandchildren. I don't remember how many, but anyway. And then Trudy Hawley, because they're going to do this in tandem. Trudy is our volunteer genealogist since 2004. She transcribed the Hawley record, those 12,000 individuals, for a computer database, which has grown to over 47,000 individuals. She separated Hawley Family's database for unconnected Hawley groups so that the ones that we knew didn't come from Joseph, they're on the side, but they're not forgotten. Trudy's husband, Paul Hawley, who's there beside her, thinks she married him just so she could research the Hawley genealogy. She is a native of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and her DNA is 100% German. Prosit. Trudy has a degree in accounting. She is also the current editor of the Hawley Bulletin. She and Society Secretary Paul Hawley reside in Minnesota. Take it, Jim and Trudy.
I want to follow up on a comment that was made by Sue Honore about tracing Hawley ancestry through Great Britain, particularly England, particularly Derbyshire, and say that we need some specimens of genes from some British people in this area, Great Britain in general, but also particularly for the Joseph Hawley group in Derbyshire. And we're so eager to get those that if you have a connection there, which it's reasonable to think might be connected to a Hawley progenitor, might be a common descendant with you to present day people in Great Britain, we'll be glad to pay for their genetic testing. And the genetic testing is really simple. You just go to Hawley tree DNA and you look up the Hawley family there, and you fill out a little information, and they will send you a little swab in the mail. And you just take that swab and you wipe the inside of your mouth, and you put it in a little test tube they send you, and you send it back to them. And you wait a few weeks and they give the result. Now, it's very important if you do get tested that you fill out the form saying that you want to share your information. The whole point of this is to share your information with other people, particularly those interested in Hawley genealogy. And that gives rise to various questions about confidentiality, and that's an interesting topic. We, in our little branch of the Hawley family, tend to follow rules which are pretty strict about medical confidentiality, essentially HIPAA rules. So we regard this as medically confidential information. We've had people in the past who have asked us to publish all of our genetic information on the internet. We have not. that information is available to a few people, or if a researcher requests, to a researcher who wants to look at that information in the Hawley Family Tree DNA database. And they may do that, but we can't have everybody wandering around the database and changing it. So other questions about confidentiality come up about, is the government collecting all this information with some evil motive? The answer is no, not the way I look at it. But the government does have access to certain of the information. For example, if you commit a crime, and in the course of committing the crime, you leave specimens of your tissue at the crime scene, and they could be small specimens, just hair or brushings of your skin or other things you can imagine. Then the government can extract the DNA from that, and it can use certain data sources to try to identify you. Now, the DNA from the Y chromosome, which is what we're really interested in, is not very important to the government. But what we call autosomal DNA, the DNA from the non-sex chromosomes, is very important. So we advise you, if you're going to commit a crime, don't leave tissue evidence at the scene. If you must, don't sign up to have your genes examined. That would not be a smart move. However, you don't have to have your genes examined to have the government learn about them, because the government can take your DNA and go to big databases like 23andMe, where millions of people have been tested, and it can see who you're related to and triangulate who the criminal who left the tissue at the scene might be, and come up with a probability list of cases. And then they can interview you and ask you for your own little tissue specimen and see if there's a match. So that's confidentiality in a nutshell. I don't think it's too scary, as long as you don't leave a lot of tissue at a lot of crime scenes. So I see Trudy seems to be enjoying this a whole lot. She's in charge of me, and if she'd like, she can give me the first slide, and I can talk a little bit more about this. And at some point, if I talk too much, she or Linda can ask me to stop. To match genes, we are mostly interested in the Y chromosome, Y DNA. And you say, why the Y? Well, the reason is that the Y chromosome is a very old, lazy chromosome that doesn't do much, that's of much practical use. It just gives males their secondary sex characteristics, which are about the most boring things you can imagine. So I'm going to keep talking. So the Y chromosome doesn't change much because it doesn't have much of a job. Other chromosomes, when the mother and the father get together and they contribute some of their 23 chromosomes to make a new baby, most of those chromosomes mix. That is, they exchange between the mother and the father. But the Y chromosome, if you are going to be a male, doesn't have anything really to mix with. So it doesn't get mixed up every time there's a new generation, which means that the Y chromosome tends to not change for many generations. How many? Well, we don't know exactly, but 4 or 5 generations. Now, when you get into 4 and 5 generations, there might be one little change, a spontaneous mutation in the Y chromosome. and that could throw off your DNA matching. But statistically, the people who do this are prepared to deal with that. So they allow a certain very slow rate of change in the DNA of the Y chromosome over the decades. So an easy way to look at this is if you have some male DNA from the Y chromosome, then if two people match 100% on that Y chromosome, they are probably brothers or a father and a son team. And then the more distant the male relatives are, the further back in time they go, the more generations before they had a common ancestor. Very slowly, the more little differences there will be in the Y chromosome. So we encourage people, if they go into family tree DNA, to work with our needs, the needs of the society, to take the Y DNA chromosome test. The merchandisers have gotten busy in DNA testing all over the world, and including in family tree DNA. But critical for our purposes is the Y DNA test. Just go directly to the Society of the Holy Family pages, and sign up for Y DNA. You will send in the specimen. You will say that, yes, you agree to share. And after some weeks, you'll get a report back, and it will show you other Hawleys who, if they've given permission to share their results, who have Y DNA very close to yours. And it will show you those who match 100%, and those who are off one gene, and those who are off 2, 3, 4, 5 genes. And that results in a statistical probability of how closely you are related to those other Hawleys who share their Y chromosome. So more genes you share, the more closely related you are, the more little differences you have. Either you're not very closely related, or your last common ancestor may have been a long time ago, allowing the Y chromosome to spontaneously mutate in a few genes over those many generations. So you say, well, if I'm interested in doing this, how many genes should I test? Because unfortunately, family tree DNA, although it's the best system in many ways, and certainly for our purposes, costs money. And the answer is as many as you can. The minimum is sort of testing 37 genes, and that's done by a technique called short tandem repeats. And that gives you sort of an introduction to the gene game. And if you match 37 for 37 with somebody, as I match with certain people who are listening to us here, like Paul Hawley, Trudy's husband, then you are really closely related. And but if you can buy 67 or 111, that's even better. I think the charge for 37 normally is almost dollar for dollar, like $50, and then it goes up as you get more genes. And finally, there's something called the Big Y. The Big Y. The Big Y tests 400 genes. It tests them by a different technique, which is called a single nucleotide polymorphism. And that allows them to test many more individual genes. I've had that test done on me to find out what it's like to have it done, and also to see how well it works, and also to serve sort of a standard for the society, so that we can have something if others get 400 genes tested to compare them with, and a few others have. It's not necessary to do that, although that gives you, as you can imagine, a whole lot more information. Now, you're never going to match 400 for 400 with any other male, because there are various sources of error in here. And one of the sources of error is just laboratory error, and another source of error. And that gives the address on the web of Family Tree DNA. And then you look up the name Hawley, join the Hawley Project. Here's a lovely slide that Trudy made showing you the Y DNA and how it's just inherited through the males in the family. So that there are a lot of people in families, but the only ones with Y DNA are the males. So ladies can get all kinds of testing done, but not Y DNA. They have to depend on their fathers or their brothers for that. And fathers, brothers, or sons that came out of their father. So that's why we use this particular Y-DNA test. It's a straight line male inheritance. It doesn't change much with time, and it's pretty persistent over many decades. If there are no questions, we could go on to the next slide. So this shows some, from my point of view, sort of ancillary data that one develops. You can imagine a couple of couples in Africa many millions of years ago, starting the human race and then spreading out from Africa and going all over the world. One place they went is to Western Europe, and they then had more and more babies, and there would be common ancestors in those groups who would have babies, and then their children would have babies. You call those founders, F-O-U-N-D-E-R-S. They founded a population, and all members of that population have certain genetic closeness in chromosomes in different ways, but including in the Y chromosome. So when you get your chromosomes tested for the Y DNA, although this also applies to the autosomal DNA, the non-sex DNA to a great extent, you can tell roughly where your people came from. And that's your people are called a haplogroup, and the genetic base of that is called a haplotype. So this shows a map of different haplotypes of different haplogroups throughout Europe and Asia, but particular emphasis to Western Europe, where actually most of the testing has been done. This is sort of a fad which grew up more or less in the Western European and Western world, but it's catching on all over the world now. And that is responsible, if you go to autosomal testing with a group like 23andMe, for these kinds of statements that you get, like you are 80% Western European, you are 5% Afro-American, you're 5% Asian, you're 5% maybe pick one, Scandinavian, nor maybe of a Viking descendant, and so that is interesting for people to know. Now, of course, in the millions of years, there's been a lot of mixing of populations. Like some people were very good population mixers, like the Vikings, who came down and managed to start populations throughout Western Europe and even maybe in the United States. So people find that interesting. It's a little hard to trace back. You're not going to find your Viking forebearer for this, but at least it enforces the notion that we're all sort of mixed breeds. We all have a lot of different genetic contributors to our present gene pool. If no questions about that, we could go to another slide.
I'll just intercede with one comment here. The haplogroup basically is one of the two things that you get out of your Y-DNA test that is of some use anyway. It generally tells you what continent you came from, your father's father's father, all the way back, what continent they came to. And R is the designation for European. If you were African, let's see, Middle Eastern, you'd have a J haplogroup. African is E or A. Asia and Oceania is C, E, or L. And American, if you think you're Native American, that would be North, Central, or South American. It would be a Q designation. But most of the Hawleys come up as R's from Europe.
Thank you. This is a picture of the Y chromosome. It's a picture of a very short version of the Y chromosome. But they mention up here STR values. So short tandem repeats are little combinations of individual genes that tend to stick together and repeat. So it's one way of looking at the many genes on the Y chromosome, on the Y chromosome. And so once again, this becomes a matching process where you would take one person and list out their genes, and another person and another person. These are called loci, or plural of locus, and the loci can be occupied by different genes, and you want to compare one person to another person. And if the comparison is perfect, the conclusion is that they are very closely related, and let's say father, son, brothers, twins, maybe identical twins would have identical genetic identical gene patterns on all of their genes, actually, autosomal and also Y chromosome. And as you expand the number of tests that you're doing, you get more and more certitude that people are related, and more guarantee that they're very closely related. But then you start to run into a few of these little complicating factors, so that you can't have 400 genes matching 400 genes using this other technique, because statistically there are just too many sources of error, like laboratory error and changes in the Y chromosome with time. So this is all a matching process. And if two people match very closely, we would say, oh, they're in a family group, like my family group would be from Joseph from Stratford. We actually find that there are a number of people who bear the name Hawley who are not particularly related to each other. I mean, they're no more related to other Hawleys than they'd be related to Smiths or Goldsteins or other family names, and makes us think that Hawley isn't a distinct true breed. It was more a name applied to a group of people who had some characteristic in common, and might be genetically different, but came from the same part of Great Britain and had some character in common. I don't want to get too far into other people's thunder, but one thought is that Hawley can be translated as a piece of land, and so we wouldn't expect to be called pieces of land, but we might expect to be called something like that if we were farmers and owned pieces of land and identified ourselves with those. So you learn how closely people are related, but you can also learn how they're not related. They're in quite different strains. But as Trudy pointed out, they would mostly, for our database, be mostly Western European, but some distinct strains of Hawleys within there. Is that enough? Any questions or?
That was great. They'll put questions in the chat room, Jim.
We left space at the end for questions and answers. This is a picture of what a man in Connecticut in about 1650 would have looked like. Of course, Joseph would be much handsomer. The treaties were signed with the Connecticut Indians, with the colonial government in about 1638, and companies were formed in Wethersfield in the area. And 1639, they started migrating down to the coast. One group was led by Reverend Adam Blakeman, and he went to Stratford, Connecticut, where they built mud huts and lived on the shores of the river while they built a stockade fence to protect themselves from the Native Americans who might not have known about the treaties that they'd signed away their rights. There are no records of Joseph in Stratford until 1650, when he bought a house lot and some farmland from Richard Mills. And the record is actually in his own handwriting. He seems to have been the first person there who could document any of the history of the area. Joseph had 3 sons, Samuel, Ephraim, and Captain John. And they had 15 grandsons out of that. He had 2 other sons who didn't have boy children, and he had 3 daughters. Thomas of Massachusetts had only 1 son, whose name was Joseph, and he had 4 sons, but only 2 of them had sons to pass on the Hawley name. All matches to this perfect DNA match with Dr. Jim are going to be a descendant of one of those 4 sons of Joseph and Thomas. These are your Hawley cousins through those 4 sons of Joseph. Bob Hawley, if you haven't been to the Arabia Museum in Kansas City, Missouri, he's a descendant of Joseph's son Ephraim. He also has the benefit of being a descendant of Thomas of Massachusetts and their sister Elizabeth Hawley Booth. His ancestor was Gideon, who had a ferry and an inn on Lake Champlain. And when the War of 1812 broke out, he marched up to Montreal to try to capture the city. and died on the way there. He had, I think, 4 to 6 sons, something like that. They came back and they decided to leave Vermont and go to Fort Dearborn, which is now the city of Chicago. It was quite the pioneer expedition. One of Gideon's sons was Aaron Hawley. He decided to leave Illinois and move to Wisconsin, but he went back to Illinois to get a herd of cattle to take back to Wisconsin. And on his way back, he was commandeered into going out to parley with the Black Hawk Indians, and he was never seen again. So the family got hit with the War of 1812 and the Black Hawk War. Bob is a descendant of Pierce Hawley, and we have his DNA sample. We also have a sample from Aaron Hawley, the martyr of the Black Hawk War, that confirms they are part of the same Joseph Hawley line, which was omitted from the Hawley record. So this is really a valuable contribution. Next, we have Ed Hawley. He's a descendant of Captain John, and he did his DNA very early on with the National Geographic Society Genome Project and transferred it into the Hawley Project. Ed's family left Connecticut, went to Albany and Syracuse and Baldwinsville, New York. You remember the picture with the pioneers struggling through the woods in the cold, and well, that gene left Ed. He lives in Tucson, Arizona. He wouldn't dream of trudging through the snow and the cold weather. He's a Navy veteran. His ancestor Nathan is the one that moved to New York and had a son George, who had a son George, who had a son Dr. George, and then George IV, who is Ed's uncle, and he did the family tree. Next, you have Jack and Paul, who are both descendants of Joseph's oldest son, Samuel. Jack is the vice president of the Hawley Society. He came to the Litchfield reunion a couple of years ago and left as the vice president. He came also with his genealogy from Nova Scotia, which is pretty distinctive. But he also had the name of his grandmother was Mary Catherine McQuarrie, which is lucky. If you have somebody with an unusual name, it's a lot easier to find out your genealogy. And we just happen to have Mary Catherine McQuarrie in the Hawley database and gave him all the rest of his ancestors back to the Joseph Hawley line. Paul is the secretary of the Hawley Society. He also happens to be my husband. Jim was talking about the autosomal DNA. I wanted to just bring this up slightly here. Paul was contacted by a lady several years ago who said that Paul's uncle was her father, her birth father. She had been adopted. So we accepted that, which she picked somebody, a stranger, unless there was some reason to believe it. So eventually DNA became commonplace, and we did a DNA test on the autosomal DNA, and it turned out that they are first cousins, and Paul's uncle is her father. So it was kind of rewarding for her to finally find out that what her Hawley roots were. Then in the bottom right corner, we have Dr. Jim. He's a descendant of Samuel also, but he's by Samuel's second wife, so he's only a half seventh cousin to the others. Jim's DNA is the gold standard for everyone else to compare to. He has a solid documented genealogy. As Linda said, she's a member of the DAR, so she's certified. And Jim is a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, so his genealogy has been certified also. Jim's family moved from Connecticut to Arlington, Vermont, and then out to Detroit, and then they moved back to the East Coast. And then you may notice that in the middle there we have Allison. We've been talking about why DNA is just for men. You can only test men's Y DNA. So why do we have Allison there? Allison inherited her genealogy from her father, who was quite avid in the genealogy. she's done a lot to document it and put it in a good order. We have a nice big folder on her family tree. They went from Massachusetts to Wisconsin to Missouri and out to Seattle, Washington. But Allison wasn't satisfied with the paper documents. She wanted some scientific research, so she went around a different way to get her DNA checked. She had her nephews checked. Now, these 7 men here all share the same Y DNA. You can tell by looking at them, none of them are twins. They don't have the same nose or eyebrows or dimple on their chin or hair color, or they're not all left or right-handed. All they share is that little tiny sliver of Y DNA. There are other branches of the Hawley family that are not related. And one of them that came up from the Hawley DNA Project was the Irish family. There are Irish Hawleys. They've identified unique populations. The scientists discovered that about 20% of Irish DNA and 17% of Scots population have Y DNA sequences in common, which lends credibility to a legend of Niall, a warrior king of northwestern Ireland around 400 AD. According to historians and scientists, they weren't sure if this guy was a real thing or if it was just a legend. But now they're, because of looking at Y DNA, they believe that it is a fact that this man actually lived. There are no paper documents left from 400 AD to check. In victory, Niall took hostages to ensure future peace. By tradition, one of the hostages he took was St. Patrick, which is rather iconic with Irish heritage. Evidently, Niall passed his unique Y DNA through his 12 sons. The clan is actually the O'Neills, but they weren't using surnames back at the time, so it's likely that someone along the line ended up with the Hawley surname in that Y DNA family. Next cluster of families we have are related to Benjamin Hawley, who was a Quaker in Chester County, Pennsylvania. Linda mentioned this earlier. Benjamin was the youngest son of Thomas Hawley, a gunsmith of London, England. Benjamin came around 1722. He went back to England, got married, came back. He made about 3 or 4 other voyages back to England during his lifetime. He was a teacher when he first came to Chester County, and he later became a farmer. If you think you can trace your family back to Pennsylvania, especially if you go to Chester County, this is a likely family to check out and look for records and connections. Rather than wasting your time looking at Joseph or Thomas of Massachusetts and Connecticut. It's a well-documented family because the Quakers kept meeting records and announced all the births, deaths, and marriages. And it's a good source of proving your family tree. They moved in large numbers to Iowa and the Pacific coast. That is also a clue to look at this family rather than one of the other ones. This is another Hawley variation. We haven't been able to connect to them, may have been related back before surnames were common. Steve Clark, who wrote this book, compiled this book, and I have a lot in common. We both married Hawleys. His wife is Mary Hawley. Their ancestor is Samuel Hawley, H-O-L-L-Y, who is in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1636. He had a son, John Hawley, who was born in 1618 in England and died in 1681 in Stamford, which is about 30 miles west of Stratford. One of their descendants was Reverend Sylvanus Hawley, H-O-L-L-Y. The story is that he lived in Wyoming County, or in Washington County, which is near to the Vermont border. And he had two sons who decided they were going to leave West or Eastern New York and move to Western New York, Wyoming County, down there in the lower right picture on the map. They decided they would probably never see their father Sylvanus again. So Sylvanus walked with them for the first day on their trip east or west and shared all his wisdom and said goodbye. And when he said goodbye, he asked them to please use the Hawley spelling, not the way he had been spelling his name. And they agreed to do that. One of the other descendants of Reverend Sylvanus who used the Haw spelling was Ella Hawley Crossett. She was a well-known New York suffragist, and she was a good friend of Susan B. Anthony. Her daughter also was Susan B. Anthony's secretary. And another family is the Myron Hawley, Holley family. He was a descendant of Samuel and John that I mentioned first, a cousin of Sylvanus. He was a abolitionist. I think he did an abolitionist newspaper in Rochester, New York. He was also an anti-Mason. If you go to his grave in the Rochester Cemetery, people are still putting pieces of broken brick on his gravestone to remember his work as an anti-Mason. He also was involved in the construction of the Erie Canal. When they audited the books after the canal was built, they came up $30,000 short. And he was so honest about it. He took $30,000 of his own money and reimbursed the investors for the shortage. His father is the one that decided to change the spelling from Holly to Holley, for no particular reason. I think he just liked the spelling. And then this next group is one of my favorite ones. Charles Benjamin Hawley is the second guy from the left there with medals on his chest. The Civil War reenactor with the 54th Massachusetts in Washington, D.C., and a descendant of the Connecticut 29th Regiment. His Civil War ancestor, his great-great-grandfather, was Orrin Benjamin Hawley, born 1826, died 1900, of Connecticut. Ben and his brother Lester were researching their history in the Connecticut archives and found a record in 1785 of Harry Hawley, the father of Orrin Benjamin Hawley, who was born of a slave and lived in Reading, Connecticut. Ben's Y-DNA group indicates that his paternal ancestry, going back as far as history, is from African origins. Ben retired in Maryland from the United States Air Force. In 2013, he was in the forefront of a Maryland group active in declaring Maryland Emancipation Day as November 1st. Maryland was the first state south of the Mason-Dixon line to abolish slavery by vote of the people in 1864. Jim, back to you.
Okay, so this is a few reminders of if you want to get tested or you want to have a male family member tested, you go to this website, www.familytreedna.com. You order at least the 37 marker Y DNA test, although if you can afford more, it'll be more informative, give you more certainty about how closely related you are to whatever line of Hawleys you turn out to be. You test the male Hawley family members, and I guess the oldest has an advantage in that you may lose him soon, and also he would have had fewer generations to mix up the genes and create confusion. You at this website, you go to the Hawley Family Project, and you make sure you give permission to share your results. And if you give your email address, they will send you emails about who you're related to, how closely, and also you may get emails from somebody who says, "Hey, I'm your son. You didn't know you had one, did you?" And that's always a shocker. So please do, if you are interested in tying down certain gaps in your genealogy, feel free to use this Y-DNA information. And if you have a connection in the British Isles, it would help us show further, more definitively, where the different Hawley branches came from in the British Isles. Let them know, let us know. If they're willing, we'll be glad to pay for testing their Y-DNA.